signing on.
HR person, because I don't know if that's staying.
Sure. All right, we'll welcome everybody. An official welcome. We've been having a good time here, getting ready for the rest of you to join us. Sorry you don't get to be a part of these conversations, but if you know old TV shows and old music, you'd fit right in.
I missed the conversation.
So let's say a prayer and then we'll jump into a number of things. This is from Exodus 24. The Lord said to Moses, "Come up to me on the mountain, and while you are there, I will give you stone tablets on which I have written the commandments intended for their instruction." So Moses set out with Joshua, his aide, and went up the mountain of the God, and the elders, however, had been told by him, "Wait here until we return to you." Aaron and Hur are staying with you. If anyone has a complaint, let him refer the matter to them. And after Moses had gone up, a cloud covered the mountain, and the glory of the Lord settled upon Mount Sinai. Loving God, we thank you for your presence among us, a presence that we don't have to beg for or seek out, a presence that is always there if we just look for it. So help us as we study Exodus to see how you have worked with your community and remind us how you work with us today, wanting us to share in your glory. This we pray in Jesus' name. Amen. All right, so maybe some of the group here enjoyed reading today's section. Some didn't like it at all. So the sad thing is next week is very similar. But there's a reason for that, why it's very similar. So we'll talk about that a little bit later. We'll see how far we get tonight, and then next week is our last week together, and then we get to Holy Week and we're at Easter. So Exodus, hopefully you've enjoyed the studying Exodus. You're all scholars now, or you will be by next week. You'll be able to just open up any part of Exodus and say, well, this is what it's talking about. I know that the priests wrote this section, and so that's why they were concerned about this, or this was part of a story that needed to be there. Before we get into the rules we didn't get to last week, any leftover questions from Ten Commandments? Because we kind of went through those real quick. I don't know if there were any from our Zoom folks that are out there. Let me just make a couple more comments about the Ten Commandments before we go into the other rules. The fourth commandment in the Catholic numbering, which is honor your father and mother. I think I mentioned this briefly, but I don't have a good memory if I did or not. That commandment is about taking care of your parents when they're old. It's not a commandment for children. There are other rules for children, and they have real strict penalties if you do things to your parents. That commandment is about taking care of your parents when they're old. So it predates Social Security. It was so that people did not abandon their parents when their parents needed to be taken care of at home, so that you were supposed to be respectful of your parents when they aged. And most of the folks throughout the history of Israel, and still in many parts of the world today, people live in kind of family compounds. And so grandma and grandpa are there, and several of the siblings are there, and the kids are there, and the cousins are there. They all are living in a big compound, so they're all taking care of grandma and grandpa as they age. But that's So that one's about caring for your folks when you're older. The sixth commandment about adultery, sorry to say, only applies to men who having sex with women who are married to somebody else. So the sixth commandment, a married man can have sex with an unmarried woman and is not committing adultery, as it was written in the Old Testament. So it's a property law in the Old Testament. So it was to guard the property of a guy who's married. So you cannot have sex with his wife because she belongs to him, but he was free to have relations with whoever he wanted to have relations with. So Jesus changes all that, but at least when in the Old Testament it was primarily a property law. So, and then there were clear penalties as you see in the New Testament, where they bring the woman to Jesus who's caught committing adultery, which has to mean she's married. Because if it was just a single woman having sex with a married man, she's not caught in adultery. So she's a married woman who's been caught. So that one, and then the only other comment I want to make about the Ten Commandments, unless there are some questions, is if people wonder, the world since the Enlightenment has tried to come up with rules that aren't based upon what God has given to us. Because as Christians and Jews, where do we get our morality system from? Is from God. So this is revealed to us by God. In the world today, it might be utilitarianism, which is kind of a pragmatic approach to morality, whatever works as long as you don't cause harm. It might be a relativism, you do your thing, I'll do my thing, I don't care what you do, as long as you're not hurting anybody else, you can commit whatever actions you want to commit. Or you might have Immanuel Kant's the categorical imperative, which says you can act any way you want as long as every other human being can act the same way. So your actions become a universal law for everybody else. So those are kind of the common ones that you see out there today. But ours, we say, are revealed by God. And I think evidence of the fact that they're revealed by God and not just written up by some human beings and saying, this is a good idea, let's write this one down, are the 9th and 10th commandment. Because they're so different from all the others. The others are clear actions. And you can make judgments on those. Did you lie or not? Did you steal or not? Did you kill or not? Those are very clear. But coveting? So how do you ever judge coveting? Because that, you're like, you were envious of my car. I know it. I know you were after that. It's 15 years old. I know you want it. I don't know how you judge coveting. Because coveting is a spiritual thing. It's trying to get people, and I've heard spiritual authors say, if everybody just followed the 9th and 10th commandment, they wouldn't break any others. So if you stopped desiring what isn't yours, and you were just satisfied with what you had, you wouldn't be after somebody else's wife, or you wouldn't have to steal anything, or all the other things would just fall into place if you stopped coveting. But it is a very, very unique command as far as you look at Middle Eastern laws, like you looked at those Hammurabi ones we passed out last week. You won't find any coveting ones in there, so stop coveting. It's very unique. So for me, that's evidence that this is of God. It's there are rules that only God would give. All right, well then let's take a little time to look at these other rules. That next section after the Ten Commandments is commonly called the Book of the Covenant. The scholars think it was meant as a guide for judges. So it's just to give some outline, because the judges are going to have to handle these cases. They're not trained judges. They're just people that Moses is appointing. Okay, you're going to be a judge, and you're going to be a judge, and you're going to be a judge. Well, how do I decide when the ox gores a boy who is responsible for that? Well, it depends. And if the ox has done it before and the owner didn't stop him, then the owner's responsible. If it's the first time, then the ox is responsible for it. And what's the penalty? If you remember last week, because this is a week ago you read this, the penalty is death for the ox if he gores somebody, and you don't get to eat him either. That's also part of the penalty. You just have to bury an ox that gores people. So these were set up to help judges make decisions. It did not cover all the rules. There was no intent to do that, but to give you some kind of, these are general guidelines that are there to follow when you're having to make decisions. So then the surprising one probably was in chapter 21, which was about slavery. And you think, oh my gosh, those people just came from slavery, and now they're here and they have slaves again? So it was, the scholars say, meant to put a limit on indentured servitude, because that's primarily what it was. So it was people who bought that house and then they couldn't pay for it. And so they ended up having to sell their kids to pay for the house, or to sell themselves to pay the bank back, or their Visa card or their MasterCard went way over. You know, you bought that TV and all the stuff for your house, and you couldn't afford it. And so then the bank comes and says, we're selling you. And somebody buys you. So if they bought you, if you recall, they can only own you for 6 years. And then, then you have to let them go. Then there's some of those little weird rules about, well, if they were single, they can leave single. If you got the whole family when you bought them, then the whole family has to stay together. But if it was a single person and you had another single person and you put those two together, then they don't stay together. No, that other one, they go separate because you put them together. Or if they fell in love with you along the way because you were working with them, then they might choose to stay with you or choose to become your spouse, because that would happen a lot of times. You know, you have a servant who you like a lot, and he goes a little too far, and pretty soon, you know, they're having a couple babies of yours, and you might as well get married then. So it was against the law to do slavery like we did slavery in this country, to send raiding parties into another country, grab people and bring them here and sell them. That was forbidden. The Jewish community never did that. Kidnapping somebody, which is what that is, and then selling them, to kidnap somebody was a crime whose penalty, if you recall, is death. So kidnapping was seen as a great theft because you're stealing a human being's life. So it's really about indentured servitude. They did take, in battles later on in Israel's history, they did take people as slaves from battle and were sold, and those were permanent slaves. Those were not on a 6 or 7 year time period because they were captured in battle. Then the next section was about violence and murder. And really the goal of those rules is to limit vengeance. So that's why they created them. That's where the eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth comes from, is it limits what you can do back to somebody who hurt you. Because the temptation, as all of us probably have, is to hurt them worse than they hurt me. They will never, ever do that again because look how much they hurt me. So I'll hurt them. So it's to limit that. There's some question by scholars as to how much it was ever practiced. Certainly the death penalty was practiced. So if you took somebody's life, they would take your life. That was not uncommon. But how many people walked around without hands? How many people walked around without eyes? You know, how many people got their teeth knocked out because it was a tooth for a tooth? You knocked that one out, I'm going to knock yours out. There's some real question is if that really ever happened. There isn't a whole lot of evidence, the scholars say, on historically that ever took place. But it's to limit vengeance. But it also required a compensation. So the scholars think a lot of times instead of the eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, they came up with the value of a hand. A hand was worth $10,000 or an eye was worth $50,000. So if that guy poked out your eye and you took that to the judge and you said, I want to poke his eye out, and the guy says, I'll settle this financially, that was agreed to. Those don't appear in Scripture, the financial amounts, but they think that probably happened pretty frequently, that they just settled it with money. Again, some people might say, well, it seems weird that you'd kill the animal that kills a human being. You know, we see this happen in zoos once in a while where somebody goes in a cage where they don't belong and the lion kills them, so then they kill the lion. And you think, well, that's not right. That person should not have been in the cage to begin with, so leave the lion alone. But the Old Testament rules would be that the animal always dies. If an animal takes a human being's life, the animal dies. To just say how important human life is, and so no animal lives, even though you know the animal didn't intend it, they were just being an animal. That's what animals do.
Isn't some of that, they didn't have rabies vaccine. So I mean, isn't some of that like a public health and like
Sure.
standpoint to an extent?
Sure. Because they might do it again. They would hurt
Right.
somebody else. Yeah.
Like you don't eat, thinking about that, especially the ox, you don't eat the meat of the ox because the ox might be like mad cow disease
Mhm. Sure.
or something like that, or it could spread to the other
Sure.
animals.
Yep. Those are all very good. All right, then there was a section of rules that dealt with property and property restoration. And almost all the way through, who's responsible? The owner. So, which isn't much different from what we have today. You know, the owner of the property is responsible. There is, if you borrow something without getting permission, then you're responsible for that. But if the owner's with you when you borrowed it, then the owner's still responsible. So there was no death penalty when it came to property. in the Old Testament. So you could never damage somebody's property so much that they would say, "Mm, you die." So it's simply compensation normally, or you have to pay back a little bit. Then there were a group of laws governing social and religious situations. And you might have enjoyed the one about, what happened if you were having premarital sex. And you ended up getting what? Married is usually what the consequence was. And so you have to just realize that these were arranged marriages most of the time. So the parents would have arranged that marriage maybe when they were young. You're going to get married to so-and-so down the street, and we've arranged that. This law governed, okay, but what if they end up having sex before marriage, and so then what should happen there? So it just kind of gave them some limits to sexual activity. It gave them some limits to what the family could do when it came to that. Sorcerers, you can't use sorcerers. People don't go to those tarot card places. Yeah, no bestiality either. And then it kind of concludes with all these, what are really, once again, I think, more ethical norms and more probably from God than we ourselves would come up with. Because the first group that are cared for in the laws are widows, orphans, the poor, and stranger. So those are people that they reach out to. You can't even charge interest to those people, so if you give them a loan, the loan is absolutely free because they're disadvantaged. There was your responsibilities to God. You have to offer God the first fruits of your crops, your animals, your children. There were rules about just treatment for everybody, non-citizens, witnesses, litigants, judicial officers. And then there were observances related to the agricultural calendar. So there were the religious events, the sabbatical year. So that is really questionable by scholars as well as if that ever happened. There's a sabbatical year and the Jubilee year. Every 50 years was a Jubilee, every 7 years was the sabbatical year. So those of you from rural areas, can you imagine not farming every 7th year?
You gotta build up your working capital to make your cash flow. Not sure that's gonna work.
The land could lay fallow, that would not, but what are you gonna do with your cattle
Right.
for that year? And what about the rest of us who want hamburger? Okay, we
You'd
can't.
be long deep.
You have to have big freezers to freeze all that, which they did not have. So the scholars question whether that ever actually took place. It's a great idea and the same with forgiving. So the Jubilee year, everything was forgiven, and all the land ownership goes back to who originally owned it. So whenever you bought a house or bought a piece of property, the idea was you were buying it for however many years up until the Jubilee year, and then it would revert back to the original family. And again, scholars are not sure if that ever happened because of how unsettled that would be for a community if, okay, you get our house, and where are we going to go, and what are we going to do? And so it's questionable whether that ever took place. So those are the rules that we didn't get to last week. And then, of course, chapter 24 is just simply Moses getting ready to seal that covenant and all those agreements, and sprinkling the blood on everybody, and spending time on top of the mountain. And the people here, as they did a couple chapters earlier, acknowledge that they're going to follow this. So, all right. So you ready to discuss and do your scholarship over all these liturgical things coming up? All right. So Zoom people, we're going to send you off into your groups and have fun discussing these. First of all, we're probably tonight just going to go through these liturgical things and then leave the apostasy for next week. So we get the golden calf and Moses' reaction to the golden calf next week. And then we get this whole thing you just did over again. Because what you get next week is the people, what they did. So these are the directions that you got today from God on how to carry this out and what to do. And then there's the apostasy, and then you get what they did. And then you get the end of Exodus, which, as we said at the very beginning, just simply means that's as far as the scroll went. And so then they went on to another scroll, and the story continues. So those of you who at Holy Week want to get into the next book, go right ahead. So the question becomes, and we'll spend a little bit more time on this next week, is why do they repeat it all over again? First of all, why did we get all this? And then why does it get repeated? So the thinking is that it's the apostasy in between. And so the writers, this is all priestly, obviously. All you scholars knew that. You said, well, this is priestly stuff. The apostasy is probably not. But on either side of it is the priestly stuff. So what the people are doing is saying a couple things here by putting these two things on either side of the apostasy, is that they went back to being faithful because they carried it out even after they had sinned tremendously. And that God also did not give up on them. We could talk about that quickly tonight, but I think we'll wait till next week as to what Moses is doing up on the mountain. As you were getting, I don't know if any of the Zoom people got that far in the discussions, because he's pleading with God not to, he hasn't even been down to see it, but he's pleading with God not to destroy everybody. Because what God offers is what he did with Noah. So this could be, we could start fresh again, but we're not going to. Because Moses pleads and says, well, it might be a great thing just to have my own little family and start all over, but he reminds God who God is, how embarrassing this would be if they get out there in the desert and get all killed, and then the Egyptians were like, well, see, God really didn't love them anyway, did he? And that'd be really embarrassing. So it is a way of saying faithfulness. So there was this apostasy in the middle, but now they're carrying through with the commands and down to the littlest details. So at least that's a good theory. So before even that, why do we have this long discourse on the construction of the tabernacle? It's 1/3 of the book of Exodus. is this. 1/3 of the book is either in the description of the tabernacle or in the carrying out. It emphasizes the importance of worship. If you give all the details about how this is to be done, it says this is very, very important. Otherwise, we wouldn't waste our time doing it. So it's important how we worship. And the whole movement of Exodus is from slavery to worship, from service to Pharaoh to service to God, from construction of Pharaoh's buildings to construction of God's building. So those are the movements that happen in Exodus. They mention the word tabernacle a lot, 58 times, tent of meeting 34 times, tent 18 times, so these words just keep getting repeated again and again and again. One of the other things, as we kind of talked about last week with the whole notion of holiness in the Old Testament, one of the need for details is going to pray to God is scary, because your encounter with the divine could get you killed. So we need a lot of details about how you're going to go and encounter God and make sure that at least the ones who we're going to let in to the inner areas are safe when they go there and don't get themselves killed. And then it's, as we talked about last week, one of the things about holiness is that you can make things impure very easily. If you're not in the right place and you haven't been cleaned appropriately and done the right things, then you can make those impure. So the fear was that if we don't set this up right for God, then some goofball comes running in to that area, or some kid, and then makes the whole thing impure, and then God leaves. And so God was hanging around, but God left because you let those kids come running into the compound and they made it all impure. So there's this need to kind of clarify. One of the other things we get is that these chapters signal a change. God has just occasionally appeared to Moses. He's done that on the mountaintop. He's done that in other little encounters. And now what's God doing? He's saying he's going to be there. So this is a big shift for God. He's only come on occasion just when he wanted to or when he got called. Now he's going to stay with them. So if he's going to stay with them, then where he stays matters. What this looks like matters. He's gone from being on top of the mountain to where? Among them, right in the middle of the camp. So he's no longer far away. God is very close. And he went from a fixed place, the mountaintop, to a movable place. So he's portable. He's going to go around the desert with them. Well, yeah. He's a nomad. He's got his old trailer and goes and pulls it along. But it really says, the humility of God. That God's like, okay, I'm going to hang with these people for 40 years until they're ready to get into the country. But if you know the rest of the history of Israel, he stays there. He fights when David wants to get him out of the tent and into a temple. He says, this is really embarrassing, God. You're stuck in that tent, and I have a really nice house. And God says, really, I've gotten used to it. You know, I've been kind of hanging around here for a couple of 100 years. It's fine. I'm fine. And then maybe someday one of your kids can build me a house, but you're not going to. I'm gonna stay in the trailer. It'll be fine. You can carry me around for a little bit longer. Now, we're going to get into some of the details here of what it looks like in just a moment. But scholars would probably say the quality of this place, which we'll talk about, they're not sure if that ever happened, because this was probably written in the time of either the temple has been built, and so they're reflecting back from their experience of the temple to the ark and the tent and what that would all look like, or it's even in Exodus or the exile. So they're already in exile in Babylon, and they're writing back from there. So it's either the monarchy when the temple's there, or exile when this was written. And if it was written during those kind of times, then some of the things why it's in there, they would say because where sacrifices happen matters. So if you got the temple already built, they want to show that this was a pattern that began from the very beginning with God. So the Exodus experience, God told us this is how you do it. This is why we're doing it in the temple to this very day. So that would be one other reason why they're repeating it, just to let people know how important that is. And then they get two gifts in the wilderness. They get the law, and they get the ark. Those are the two gifts that they get from God. All right. So those of you on Zoom received these this morning. I'll hand these out. These are scholarly drawings of what this probably looked like.
I just followed what I was reading.
Okay, this has to be.
No, so Diane did a great job here. She,
Oh, no.
Think of those chairs.
yeah, she did. All right, so we'll just kind of walk through again what you've already been discussing as to what the parts are there. So there were, of the materials in chapter 25, there were 7 different categories that you probably recall. There's metals, and then there was yarn, and then there were skins, and then there was wood. And however they used those must have been obvious, because there's no clear directions. They just say, this is what you're going to use. Well, how do we use yarn? But the oil, the spices, and the gemstones, there were clear directions on those 3. So those are those 7 different categories of the different kinds of materials you were supposed to put together. What type of wood did they use? Acacia wood. And why did they use acacia wood?
That was the only wood around.
They would have had a limited amount of wood there in the desert.
What was it about the acacia, but I don't remember.
So it's often used for lawn furniture, outside patio furniture, because it does not rot. And termites don't eat it. So it's, there's They found ancient acacia wood that, still there, hundreds and hundreds of years later. They still find it not rotten. So acacia lasts. So you can make that for your patio furniture. Get some acacia wood, and you could say, God lived in this. It wasn't, he lived in an ark made of the same kind of wood, acacia wood. Yeah, it's good. Then we'll do it too. I can sit here. Then it goes on it talks about the mercy seat in chapter 25. But it's more likely a cover if you look at that first figure there of building the ark. Clearly, God didn't come down and sit there, so that was not. The mercy seat was somehow on the wings of those cherubim, and it might be more like a footstool or something for God, but there's no actual seat when it talks about a mercy seat that God sits on. Then it asks for the table and the lampstand, which is made for plates, bowls, dishes, incense, pitchers, bread, libations, basic food stuff. The lampstand was a light source. It was made out of what? The lampstand? Pure gold. And how much gold was used? 1 talent was the amount of gold that was used for the lampstand, which is 70 pounds of gold. Is 1 talent. It's huge. Today's value is $1,948,000. We don't have any lampstands like that here at Cabrini. I would like a new lampstand, and I could go to the parish council. It's only 1.9 million. Come on. So you look at all the gold that's used, and you think, wow, they either brought a lot out of Egypt because, to make that calf too, so they made a pretty good sized calf out of gold. So that, I always think it's kind of funny, and we'll talk about this next week again, but do you recall how Aaron got the calf made?
Out of the earrings, out of their ears.
Yeah, so he went and asked the guys to get their wives' jewelry. And the speculation is that he used that methodology to delay it a couple days because he knew that the women are like, what? You're taking my jewelry? No way, I'm not giving that to you. And so that would have taken several days of fighting among the people till he finally got enough gold to make the golden calf. But it's a huge amount of gold. Either they brought a huge amount of gold with them, or more likely the gold comes from a later period in Israel's history.
Did they
And
keep the golds from the Egyptians when they left?
Did they pay for it?
Yeah, I mean,
No.
I thought didn't they take from the Egyptians when they left?
Well, they asked
Take the
for it.
gold? Right, they asked for it.
Yeah.
Right, gold and silver, I mean-
So for a couple of things, they thought, at least as it's looked back upon, that the people had, even though they were slaves, had good relationships with their Egyptian neighbors. And then they were leaving, and so they went to their neighbors and said, we're heading on a long trip.
Right.
We need some help. So could you help us out with some gold? And
Yeah.
to GoFundMe page, yeah. And,
Okay.
yeah.
I ran across an article the other day that they're excavating in an area that they think is Mount Zion, and they have found several sets of gold earrings.
Oh, really?
In that area, yeah, so you bring that up and like, Oh, I just read about it.
Yeah.
We got it the other day.
It is amazing how ancient jewelry is, because when you go through those museums and you look at stuff from Egypt, okay, that's 1,500, 2,000 years BC,
Yeah.
and they're wearing jewelry.
Yeah.
And you think, okay, 4,000, 5,000 years ago, they were making jewelry. Yeah, it is amazing. The lampstand was made to look like what?
Menorah. Well,
Well, it looks like a menorah,
right.
but what is it supposed to be? So there's a picture of the lampstand in here. Now, because it's kind of flattened, you may not immediately jump to what this is supposed to look like. But,
Supposed to be a bush.
so a tree, yeah. And it even says branches, as it's telling you the design, those are supposed to be branches. And what are on it are images of blossoms and leaves that are coming out. Almond blossoms, yeah. So, and which is one of the first trees that blooms in the springtime. So, the almond tree. So the image is of the tree of life. So the lampstand is giving light, which brings us life. So it would probably look, if it wasn't flattened, maybe more like a tree if the branches went around the center piece, but it's a tree. It represents life. It represents fertility. The light appears at the end of those branches. So, all right, and then in chapter 26, we get this structure and dwellings, which there's several different images here of the tabernacle coverings and what the tabernacle interior were like. They were supposed to be what colors? The yarn? Blue, purple, and
Red,
crimson. So, you might have seen this in other articles that our names for colors have multiplied tremendously in just the last few years of human existence. So we specify different shades of things, but not all that long ago, green didn't exist. It was blue, and blue was green and blue. So there was no difference between the green grass and the sky. That was the same name until more recently. So scholars then would speculate what colors these actually were, because we've changed the names of things over the years so frequently. However, because they think the blue might have been more green. So they say, well, that could have been green. So it may have been green. The purple is very, very, very rare. So purple, it took 12,000 of these little mollusks to be crushed to make 1.4 grams of dye.
Oh my gosh. 1.4 grams?
Yeah, 12,000 of them to make 1.4 grams. 1 pound of silk, purple silk, 1 pound of purple silk cost $100,000. It's more expensive than gold.
That's why purple was the color of royalty. 'Cause
Right.
You had to be rich to be able to afford.
Yeah,
'Cause
yeah,
it took so many mollusks.
yeah, it was very rare. So when God is saying do it in purple, they're like, oh, you got to be kidding, this is going to cost a fortune.
Purple, you mean?
And so,
Purple, blue.
because these are those curtains that are hanging all around the place. So the lampstand is 1.9 million. So what's the those curtains that are going around the place, they'd be
No wonder he doesn't-
millions.
He doesn't need to live in a house. He's got a pretty sweet desert pad.
Yeah, he said, this trailer is really expensive. So, yeah, those curtains, those 11 curtains are what, 45 feet by 6 feet? 45 feet of yarn that, yeah, that cost $100,000 a pound for, yes. Yeah, then there's the frames that are covered by skins, so kind of pinned all together so it looks like it's solid. As you can see in that figure 13 there's the curtain separating the kind of the Holy of Holies where the ark is hidden from where the rest of the people are. The eastern end is left open, and then into, even woven into the cloth are images of the cherubim again. So what these cherubim actually look like, if you Googled it, the Ark of the Covenant, you'll get all kinds of different pictures of what it might have looked like, because so this is like a griffin. So it's a winged lion. So it's speculation that it was like a griffin, but we're not sure if it really was.
Kind of looks like a sphinx.
Right.
It does.
Yeah, it's what they would have known.
Very true.
Yeah.
It does.
Yeah. Yeah, so one of the struggles for rabbis and scholars over the years is we've just gotten the commandment from God, thou shalt not make any images. And then what do I want on top of the ark? A couple images. Could you do a couple cherubim there? And in the lampstand, could you make it look like a tree with leaves and blossoms? And can you weave some of that right into the cloth on the side? So, yeah. Yeah, so you think, okay, so what, from a Roman law perspective, so what church law follows Roman law style. Roman law would say if the lawmaker does something contrary to the law has been changed. So it's who does the breaking of the law. So the lawmaker changes it, it no longer applies. They're acting different than the law that they gave. So that's a Roman principle of law. So you just follow, you watch the archbishop and he does something different. And you say, okay. I guess the law changed.
Is there just one lawmaker? There's just one guy, one person has all that power?
For the church,
Well, no, for the lawmaker that you're talking
this is God. God's the lawmaker, and God quickly changed the law because his own design, which is coming from God too, is got griffins and trees and other stuff in it.
Yeah.
When we talked about that in our group, part of our thought was that there's a difference between using images to replace God and using the images
Right.
to praise God.
Right.
And if that was maybe why those images, like if that was.
Yeah, so the Jewish community was not strict like some of the Protestant communities would be today, especially like Quakers or those who have absolutely nothing, just white walls and empty or clear windows. They were never as strict, and so the Catholic Church emerges out of that experience, and so we have never been strict about it either. So how that commandment is interpreted, we would say, well, if you make a graven image representing God, so you're saying that this thing is God, well, that's clearly prohibited by the commandments. But to have a picture of Jesus, some image of Jesus, we're not worshiping that image. We aren't saying that that's Jesus, or it's not somebody else. So we don't have which is why, from our perspective, that command seems to be abrogated, at least in its strict interpretation by God himself, shortly afterwards. So, yep. The courtyard there is this outdoor space where people could gather, and that's where all the sacrifices were done, was outside. So none of the cooking of the meat was done inside the roofed structure. So that was all done outside. The altar outside that things were prepared on is quite large. 7.5 foot by 7.5 foot by 4.5 foot. It's wood covered by bronze. It has horns on each of the corners. You can see in that image there, they kind of have those kind of pointy things on the corners there. The thought was that if you were around that facility, you should be able to see over the fence and see that large altar in there. So people, even though they weren't inside the compound, the altar was visible from outside of it, which is why it was big. You might have to get a little ways away. You couldn't be right up next to the fence and see over it, but you could get a little ways away from it and know what was going on in there.
So, Father, could common people go into the courtyard around? Could common people?
Yeah, probably maybe just men could go in there, but yeah.
They keep
Come
their
on,
earrings.
baby.
Membership has its privileges.
It's that macho. Oh my God.
We don't want God running away.
And God's directions for building that altar outside in the courtyard,
Uh-huh.
it really sounded like he was building a huge barbecue pit.
Right.
A grate, something to catch the ashes. It's like, oh my God.
Yeah,
And we still practice that today.
Right on.
right, yeah,
We had the first Weber.
yeah.
Weber.
And then the oil for the lamp was made out of what? Crushed olive oil. Yeah, which was common in the Middle East, still used to this very day to light lamps. It was in Jesus' day. That's how everybody got around was, and they're everywhere. If you go to the Middle East, you can buy thousands of year-old oil lamps. They're there by the hundreds of thousands. They're a little expensive, but ancient oil lamps are there. They have all different sizes, little bitty ones, bigger ones, because you just put a wick of some kind in the end and fill the lamp itself with oil. Then you just light the wick, and that on the end of that lamp, then that gave you light in your bedroom at night, or got you through over to the neighbors, or it's where you read your prayers or your book at night with the oil lamp. It was, in this, it was probably the highest quality oil here in the Holy of Holies. but most people would not be using high-quality oil to burn. So that, I don't know if it's the third or fourth pressing of the olives that gives you the oil that's used for burning. Because you know, when you go to the store, you're buying either extra virgin, which is the first pressing, or the second pressing is not as high quality, and the third pressing, and then the fourth pressing. And so there are a number of different pressings to get the different grades of olive oil. Then in chapter 28, of course, we get the priest vestments, which are really, really important. what the priests are wearing.
Those would weigh to wear all.
Oh, yeah. I would think so.
Oh, and hot.
So the tunic is just the standard clothing that everybody wears. So that they just wanted to make sure he had a tunic on before he put on the rest of the stuff. But none of the rest is ordinary. So all the rest of those things were unique to the priesthood. The sash would not have been very big, but a ceremonial cloth that high officials wore. The special turbans, headgear for those officials. And then the robe was associated with royalty, so the priest would wear the robe. It most likely, I don't recall if it said this in Exodus or not, it had bells on it. Did the robe have bells on it? Yeah, okay.
And
Down at the end.
pomegranate.
Yeah, and that's to chase away evil spirits. So the bells were thought to get, it's not just walking out in the woods with bear around, but that the evil spirits ran away from the bells. Then it was, what was really unique to the priests were the ephod and the breastplate, which had very clear descriptions as what gemstones belong in there. And those were very expensive, different gems as well, beautiful ones. And then, so the breastplate had 12, and the ephod just had 2. The ephod, did anybody look it up to see what an ephod looked like? So it looks like an apron. So, you know, it's an apron that starts up here and goes down to about mid thigh. And it just goes on the front, and it has a tie in the back. I thought, oh, it looks just like an apron. But a very fancy apron. However, what were those priests doing when they're offering sacrifices? They're cooking. What do you need when you're cooking? An apron. So you got to have that apron because it's going to get your robe dirty. Yeah. If you have enough gemstones, yeah, you can, because all that grease just slides right off of the gemstones.
Have
And
you ever seen like a real one of these, a real rebuilt or anything?
no, I haven't. That would be cool.
Oh, very cool.
So the Orthodox community doesn't still make their rabbis use those for certain things?
That's a good question. Certainly none that I've visited. They will have robes, but none of the rest of this stuff with it.
Oh,
But there might be some real traditional ones that do. That would be a good thing to look up.
I don't like Hasidic or however you
Hasidic,
pronounce it, like some
yeah.
of them that are, yeah, there you go.
Yeah. Some of those new museums of the Bible that have been built are actually pretty balanced, and they may have kind of rebuilt an Ark of the Covenant kind of scene there, so that might be something to look into to see if they've done that. Yeah, it would be kind of cool. Then the priests, of course, get ordained or consecrated to make sure that they're holy, changes their status, gives them that anointing. And then in chapters 30 and 31, we just get an addendum, some afterthoughts. There's an incense altar, there's the anointing oil, There's the stuff about the artists, and then there's the Sabbath observance. So those are kind of, it's like the guy who was writing this got all through and said, oh, wait a minute, we forgot. There's a couple more things here that we have to add to explain it all. All right, we went a little bit longer than expected, but any last questions? Okay, so we'll do the golden calf next week and finish up. And
Those guys.
it does go fast. And you're all experts in Exodus now, so you'll be ready to,
We know how to spell it.
Other questions for me?
yes, there are. Can't let you go without your questions.